About to record. Okay, you're on.
Okay. I really appreciate everyone coming tonight. I wanted to invite a number of people to hear a little bit about Mike Quinn's new book, The Mormon Hierarchy, the Wealth and Corporate Power volume. This volume, volume number 3, is the third of a trilogy of Mormon Hierarchy books, and he'll be talking about that. I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about Mike and this long journey that it's been. This series of books on the Mormon Hierarchy, the Mormon Hierarchy Origins of Power, and the Mormon Hierarchy Extensions of Power, and now the third book, Mormon Hierarchy, Wealth and Corporate Power, has been, in the works since the late 80s, when Mike first started working on that. And so I wanted to give him a chance to talk about it and let people know about it. The book will be available in hardback in October, I guess mid-October, right?
Yeah.
So you can purchase copies of the book. It's only in hardback? Yeah.
No, it's on Kindle right now.
Oh, that's right. It's also on Kindle. So it's on Kindle now, but it'll be published in hardback. I just wanted to give a little bit of background about my relationship with Mike and why he's so important in my life. I met Mike in 1983 at BYU when I asked him to speak, to write a paper on LDS views of LDS church leaders' views on war. I was co-chairing a peace symposium at BYU, and I remember Mike and I walking up a hill together at some event, and I asked him if he would be willing to present on this topic, which he did, and that speech turned out to be quite profound and groundbreaking, and Peggy Fletcher's staff published it in Sunstone magazine. What year did that come out? 84. So 83 he gave the talk, and 84 it was in print. It's interesting because we met in 1983 through that event, and 10 years later, in 1993, we were excommunicated together for his work and my work on my book, Women and Authority. So that was a momentous decade from 83 to 93. During that decade, Mike was prolific. He published a number of books and articles on Mormon history, and I managed to publish one book. But we also got to know each other through his mentoring and advising me on researching Mormon history. I was very, very lucky enough to get the mentorship and advice of Mike Quinn in the 80s and 90s when I was working on my research and projects. So during the time when I was working on Women and Authority, Mike advised and mentored me in that project. And I guess I repaid him by coercing him to write an article against his, not against his wishes, but I talked him into writing an article on women in priesthood. I wanted Mike to answer for us, did women have Melchizedek priesthood? What is their relationship to Melchizedek priesthood? I wanted someone of Mike's caliber to really answer that question for us, and so I harassed him for a couple of years, and every time he turned in a draft, I asked him for more. Could you please take it further? We need more. We need you to really, really, nail this down for us. And so I kind of harassed him for 2 years.
It started out as 2 paragraphs.
It started out as, I approached him with my idea for the article in Women in Authority, and he said, well, I've written a response to Linda Newell in Sunstone. Take a look at that. That might be what you're looking for. So I went and looked at it and came back and said, well, it's a start, but I really want more, and so he would do more, and he would send it to me, and I'd say, can you do more? And so I kept pushing and pushing until finally he said, no, there's no more. This is it. This is everything. This is all I can do. And I think at that time, Mike said that I was the only editor who had actually added footnotes to his article. All the other editors he'd worked with had tried to remove footnotes. And do I still hold that distinction as the only editor who's ever added footnotes to Mike Quinn's work? So I'm proud of that. Anyway, an interesting thing happened though along the way. During that decade, between 83 and 93, I started doing research at LDS Archives in June of 1986, and that same month they had a new policy that they announced where if you were going to do research there, you had to sign an agreement that you would not publish anything you found in church archives without letting them review it first. And pretty much many of the scholars that I knew refused to sign that agreement. I was willing to sign it, I was fine, so I signed it, and I suddenly found myself in demand as a researcher for a whole lot of people on a lot of projects. So I was in a position to be able to help people with research. And during that decade, Mike worked on and published Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview, landmark, groundbreaking book, completely reframing Mormon origins. And I was lucky enough to share some background material with him on that while I was working on Mormon history. And then he also worked on same-sex Mormonism and same-sex dynamics. Or actually, let's see, same-sex dynamics in 19th century America, a Mormon example, is that the right title? And so I did a little bit of research on that and shared some research for that project as well. And again, was very lucky to get the mentoring and help that I got from Mike. When he was working on the Hierarchy books, he asked me to do some research on Mormon companies. The companies that were created between the 1880s and 1920s with LDS church leaders on their boards. And so I was assisting him with some research on that topic. And I also had done some research on Danites that I shared with him. And so I wound up doing, he asked me to check some sources and look up some things. So I wound up researching the companies and which church leaders were on those companies. And it was a mind-blowing experience to discover how many dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of new companies church leaders created on paper during that period between the 1880s and 1920s, with several of the same church leaders on the boards. You saw the same names over and over again. And Mike and I used to send notes and emails back and forth about that project, and I would laugh about some of the names of the companies. They were hilarious. It was a pretty smart idea because it enabled the church to interface with other companies at that time and attract money and increase cash flow and bring more money into church companies and into the church itself. And I think, and I hope Mike will talk about this, it's interesting that during that time, that same time period, Lorenzo Snow in, 1898, launched paying tithing as something, a new church-wide program that would bring the church out of debt and help balance the books. And apparently, and I think in Mike's book, he said, the new book, he says that he quotes, I think Clausen, or I can't remember which one, that the tithing accounted for half of it. The tithing brought about half of the money needed to bring the church into balance again financially. And I wonder how much the new companies, all the creation of all these new companies and the revenue that they were generating, how much that also helped the church to recover. There was a great quote in the book where Clausen says in 1903 that it will be less than 3 years to cancel the present church indebtedness. And then in 1907, Joseph F. Smith said, the church owes not $1 that it cannot pay at once. So the church recovered during that period between the 1890s and the 1920s, partly due to all of these companies that were created. Even though some of the companies lost money, some of them were not helpful and others gained money, but also due to tithing. And that dual focus of the tithing of the church and these new companies all happening at that same time, a really interesting dynamic that I hope he'll address. I wanted to share a couple of names of some of these companies. It seemed like they were creating companies every week, and so I wanted to share some of the names of them because they're really kind of funny. Mike and I used to laugh about some of the names of these companies. One of our favorites was the Anti-Friction Journal Box and Divided Car Axle Company. That was kind of one of our two personal favorites. The American Institute of Provo, that's kind of a funny one. The Church Slaughterhouse, Clap and Drown Mill, the Cooperative Drug Company, Deseret Bee Stock and Fish Company, Deseret Hemp, Deseret Syndicate, Deseret Theological Institute. I'd like to bring that one back. Does that still exist? Can we resurrect that? I propose we do. Deseret Tobacco Company, the Ensign Amusement Company, the Foreign Lands Corp., the Friendship Rural Cemetery Association, the Globe Saloon, the Half-Breed Land Company, Hardy and Moon, Joseph Smith Jr.'s Barroom, the Midget Marble Mill Construction Company, the Pacific Nut Butter Company, the Salamander Sawmill, the Salt Lake City Insane Asylum, the People's Organ, that's a fun one, and our all-time favorite, the all-time winner of funny company names, the Mutual Creamery. So this book, this third volume in the Hierarchy series, is an absolutely, as with all of Mike's work, it's an absolutely exhaustive, thorough study of the personal wealth of church leaders and whether or not a lay ministry should be paid or not, and if it's paid and how much they were paid, and was it fair or unfair. The Mormon socialism, there's a great quote in the book about the Mormon tendency to be socialistic economically in the 19th century as the Mormon voice in the wilderness of unrestrained free enterprise. In this volume, he also talks about the trustee and trust and the evolution from the trustee and trust to trustees to corporation of the president, to the corporation soul. And he discusses corporate Mormonism, the leaders as corporate managers, the corporate and business side of the church, leaders' salaries and role in corporations, corporate and financial side of leadership, the church relationship with businesses, the church's massive connections with corporate America, church finances, general authorities, salaries, and on and on. It's like all of Mike's work, it's exhaustive in its scope and in its depth and its research. And it's a masterwork. It's very satisfying and inspiring to see this long journey come to completion of these 3 volumes that began in the 1980s and is now complete. I also think that Mike's work, because Mike's work is so thorough and because he simply lets the sources tell the story, this winds up revealing truths, surprises, information both positive and negative. And above all, it offers a deeper explanation with a deeper understanding of the information, the historical story, because of the way that Mike explores it. So with all of that introduction and with my gratitude to Mike for being a mentor and a teacher when I was trying to learn Mormon history and how to research it, with all of that, I want to turn the time over to Mike to let him discuss this journey and these 3 books, and particularly this 3rd book in the Hierarchy series, and how he feels about all of that and how he thinks it'll be received, and et cetera, et cetera. So,
Thank you.
take it away.
During this first part, I'll talk eyes to the camera and wander down memory lane and give a summary of things about this most recent volume, and then I'll open it up for those of you who have questions or comments, and then I'll get eye contact with you and answer questions or respond to comments that you might have. This has been an embarrassingly long journey getting this book done, and it actually began in a seminar, a graduate seminar that I took, a 2-term seminar at the University of Utah from Davis Bitton, who at that time was an assistant church historian with Glenn Barrington as the church historian. And the seminar was on historical methods. And I had not been an undergraduate history major. In fact, I'd taken only one optional course beyond the requirements for graduation in history, and that was a course on Renaissance and Reformation. And that was the course background, very limited, that I had. I'd been reading academic footnoted history since I was 9 as a hobby. And because I'd read so much and felt that I, of course, knew everything that I needed to know, I decided that I didn't want to minor in history when I was majoring at BYU in English literature. And so I minored in philosophy and took only that one alternative or optional course as an undergraduate. So as a graduate, when I switched from English literature as my focus to history, I had a lot of catching up to do because I really had, aside from my personal reading of what interested me, I didn't have a directed line of inquiry for how to be a historian. And Davis Gooden provided that for me in this course. And one of the things, aside from how to think historically and how to think as a historian, the emphasis of the course was on new directions in methods of doing history. And among those was psychobiography, women's history, which had just barely become a part of the academic emphasis by the time I started this course in 1972 at the University of Utah. And demographic history, which is the study of large populations over time, with reference usually to certain topics that can be dealt with when you're looking at a large population over time. You have to limit the number of topics. But one of the methods that he emphasized was group biography. And I'd never heard of this before. And he had one assigned text and one alternate text that I read in this class. And one was about the British Parliament during a period of about 50 years. And it looked at the members of the Parliament as though they were a single individual. And it described all of their characteristics and then established what were the trends or the lack of trends within the Parliament during this time period in the biographies of these men. And so that you looked at this institutional group as if it had a dynamic life of its own, and then you tried to describe it. What is that like? Then another book I read had a non-institutional focus, and it was looking at the Florentine elites during the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, and its coverage was about 3 centuries earlier. And the people who were in that were not in it because of a position, a formal position they held, but because of the power that they wielded within a time period. And the Italian author, and it was in translation of that study, provided the same kind of approach, looking at this group of individuals who had no formal institutional ties to one another, but were united by their use of power and their cooperation in exerting power of various kinds within the Florentine Republic. And so those became guidestones for me. And then at the conclusion of this seminar, it was a 2-term seminar, and for the conclusion we were to present a long paper, and it was to be 30 to 50 pages using one of these types of approaches that were, quote, new in the discipline of history in the early 1970s. And the one that intrigued me was group biography. And so I read this one about the institutionally defined group, the English Parliament, and then I read one about the non-institutionally defined group, which was defined by how they acted as people within this community. And I wanted to write a paper, and I was thinking, well, what group can I write about? And I thought about the U.S. Senate, and then I thought about, well, maybe the Utah legislature. And then it occurred to me, oh yeah, the group I've been reading about ever since I was 16, when I started reading church history texts, beginning with Joseph Fielding Smith and Essentials in Church History, the general authorities. And so I wrote my paper, and I analyzed certain things like places of birth and the educational background of these men. And that's how this thing started in 1972 with this paper that eventually grew to become my master's thesis at the U. And then it became an extension of it, became my PhD dissertation at Yale. And then it moved into what I had thought up until 1992 was going to be a one-volume history of Mormonism. And I gave what I'd written on a variety of topics about the hierarchy during the first century of Mormonism, 1830s to 1930s. And the response was, this is more than a book. This is going to have to be at least 2 volumes. And so with that editorial direction, I added chapters that the editors indicated would be nice to have, and I divided the 2 volumes into the early years of Mormonism up to the arrival of Brigham Young in the Salt Lake Valley, and then from that arrival in the Salt Lake Valley to the year of publication, right up until the fall of 1996, when I had delivered the manuscript to the publisher. And so in the process, in 1975, when I was working on this for my master's thesis, I began looking at businesses and the general authorities' role in business corporations. And so I started with Salt Lake County, and Salt Lake County was one of 3 counties that had preserved all of the corporate documents for every company that had been incorporated from the initial period of incorporation, where you have a general incorporation law that does not require, as it did prior to that incorporation law, each incorporation to be made by an act of the legislature. And that was the old system. It was a system used in all the states of the Union. It was a system that had been used in Utah Territory up until the late 1860s. And then from that time forward, you, as an intended businessman wanting to incorporate a business, you could fill out the required papers and give a copy of your articles of incorporation to the county clerk, and give a copy to the territorial secretary of state, and your company would then be incorporated. And it was a simplified method. And in both the United States and in Utah Territory, what the result of these kinds of general incorporation laws was that the numbers of corporations exploded, because you no longer had to go through the thickets of a legislative session to get a company incorporated. And so there was a massive increase in corporations. And Utah, in most of the counties, had destroyed most of the papers connected with these filings. But the the county of Salt Lake had kept all of the papers, including all the subsequent bonds of elections of directors and officers. And so this was a gold mine for doing what I wanted to do, and that was to see over time how the general authorities were involved in businesses. And so I went through the numbered corporations, and the first one was number one, and I think it was, if it wasn't ZCMI was close to being number one in the late 1860s. And then I concluded with the last one that was organized in 1932, which was my cutoff date, and that was about 13,000 number corporations. So I went through all the paperwork of those 13,000 companies starting in 1975. And it was too much, and it was incomplete for me to put in my master's thesis, so I just kept it as research material. And then I went to Yale, and I was thinking, well, I'm going to do it for Yale. Well, it was too big to go on my dissertation. My dissertation had a more streamlined emphasis, and so this business thing didn't go in that. And so as I was working from that time period forward, I'd get tired of doing the business thing. So I'd work on the business for about 2 years in the 70s, and then I'd drop it. And then something would come along that would give me an inspiration. In this case, it was an invitation to talk about businesses to Mormon History Association in 1994. And so I, as a result, looked at the general authority's involvement in businesses in 1983 and 1984. And I intensively researched that for about a year and then dropped it. After I gave the paper, I was tired of it and had other things I was interested in or had to do because I was working full-time as a professor at BYU, and I was in a bishopric as well. So that was time-consuming. And so it was just easier for me to drop business and give my attention to someone else. Because frankly, the research for business, although it produced interesting findings, it was really tedious. And I would sometimes fall asleep over these corporate documents. And so that's why, I mean, typically I would work each decade for about 2 years and then drop it again. And I did that in the 90s and then dropped it. And then I found when I was writing the books on the hierarchy for origins of power and extensions of power, that there just was not enough room there for the appendix that I wanted to have about these businesses. And so the only room that we could eke out was my listing the companies that each of these men was involved in during the period from up until the end of 1932. And so I listed in biographical sketches of these men, their company activity. But I just listed the company names, and that was it. I didn't have time, I had the time, there wasn't space. And there's a kind of a secret. Connie Disney was the one who initially set up the pagination and the type size, because that affects the total page count and the spaces between lines and the margins. I mean, all of that can either reduce or increase the number of pages in the book. And she came to me one day and just said, Mike, we've got to do something about this book, because the first run through, it came up to 1,000 pages in print. And so we ended up almost moving to tissue paper to print it on, and narrowing the margins and narrowing the spaces between lines and going to smaller point size. And with that, it was just very clearly impossible for me to do this business. And so the first volume, Origins of Power, I think was 650 pages, and the second volume was 750. And they both originally started out over 1,000, and it was through the magic that Connie Disney was able to produce as a way of reducing all those things that affect page count, that we were able to get it down to the page count that we got it. Then I was tired of the hierarchy, and I went on to do other things, and yet I had this gigantic appendix. And at the time that I published the Extensions of Power in 1997, I had a chapter on business, and in that chapter I said there were 900 companies that these men were involved in, and that was as of my research at that day. Well, after dropping this into the files that I had just kept in dust and kind of ignoring, in the early part of the 21st century, I knocked on Signature's door again, and I said, I really would like you to publish this appendix, because the books list the names, but people who are looking at those sketches have no knowledge of anything about these names. They're just names. There's no indication about what role the person had, over what time period, and I said, this appendix will do that. And at that point, Albert was one of the ones that I worked with in my first article about this, which was in Sunstone magazine in 1991. And I published an article about church business and finance, but it was, again, an abbreviated thing. It could only be about 25 pages. But when Ron Prittis, who was the managing director of Signature Books, reviewed my proposal, he said, I can see where this has value, but he said, we're not going to publish an appendix as a book. He said, you're going to have to provide us with an overview, with something larger than just simply this one damn fact after another about 900 companies, which it was at the time. And I groaned and moaned, and I just said, I'm so tired of this. And he said, well, I'm tired of hearing you want it to be published, because we're not going to do it unless it's really a book, unless it's a legitimate book on its own. We're not going to publish essentially just an appendix, which would be maybe 150 pages and or less, and we just don't do that. And we publish real books, and what you're proposing is not a real book. So I moaned and groaned, and finally came back and said, okay, I'm going to start working on a real book about this. Well, I started working on it part-time because I was doing other things in the early 2000s. But those ended in 2008, and so in June of 2008, I started working full-time on what is now Wealth and Corporate Power. And I worked on it full-time from June 2008 until about June 2012. So for about 4 years, that was the only thing I was working on. And then I gave the manuscript to Signature, but they had a big backlog of other books. And so mine was the last in line, and in the process, about every year, I would ask, well, is it okay? Usually I do this in January. I'd say, well, the first of the year, have you started editing the book? No. Well, gee, then can I add some stuff? And so I would be doing research in the interim and finding more companies and more activity and more data to provide. And the thing I kept expanding was this appendix of these companies, because everything else was pretty well set. The chapters were really fleshed out versions of the data that were in 21 appendixes. And that was how I sent it to Signature in 2012. It had the same 21 appendixes that you have now, except one of them kept growing. And It now is in print, 280 pages. And it now, instead of the 900 companies that I counted in 1997, when that book came out, it now has 1,800 companies, almost 1,900. So things grew. It took, like with much of the research I do, it takes on a life of its own, and it drags me along. And it's been a very long path. And so when I contemplate now that I have been working on this thing for 42 years, it's just staggering. That, I mean, I started intensively working on the businesses in 1975, and now 2017, it is finally coming into print. And it's also electronically available as a completed book as well, but it's been a long haul. And I've told people privately, and I've said this to some meetings too, that when I eventually hold the bound book of its own, I'm going to cradle it like a baby because it has been a hugely long gestation period for this book. But I'm glad, and people along the way, since I had it there, the manuscript, the original provisional manuscript, to signature books in 2012. People have said, "Oh, have you seen this on the internet? Have you?" Or I have a friend who works in such and such, and he or she may be able to give you some information. And I said, that can go in your book. I am done. However, I am glad for the backlog that caused the delays, because as late as December 2014, the Salt Lake Tribune and other print media outlets published 2 enormously important documents about church incomes of the general authorities. And if I had published as early as I wanted to, I would not have had that information. And because it was still available for me to, still possible rather, for me to do revisions and additions due to those disclosures that came out in December 2014, the book is much, much better now. I mean, actually, they came out in 2016, I guess. The book is more complete. And I'm very grateful, even though it was frustrating, the length of time it took for the backlog to be cleared and all of that. I'm very grateful because it allowed the editors to point out things that they thought I should explain better, that I hadn't explained well enough for a general reader. And I try to do that, but you know, when you're a writer, you're just too close to the material. And then it allowed these other media print things that was not one I would say that can go in your book. I wanted it to go in my book. It was essential, and it's there. So even though I felt frustration for a few years about the delay that was necessary, because I came late to the party about getting this book published. I mean, there were a lot of books ahead of me, but I'm very glad that I did not publish it as soon as I had wanted to. So it's a much, much better book for the editing and for the sources that I would have missed had I seen it in print in 2013, which is what I really hoped for, and been hoping for, and which was impossible. Okay, now some of the things I found. Aside from the fact of nearly doubling the number of businesses that general authorities were involved in, I divide these into categories. Because I don't want to exaggerate or give an impression that would be exaggerated to the reader. I don't want to give the impression that the general authorities, as general authorities, were involved in all of these 1,800, nearly 1,900 companies. And so what I distinguish is companies that involved the general authorities while they served as general authorities. And this gigantic Appendix 5 covers the period down to 1932. And so it's the general authorities' involvement in companies business before 1933. And that includes people who were not general authorities as early as the 1810s. And I've traced their involvement there. But I don't count those. I distinguish three different kinds of numerical counting, or totals, semi-totals, I guess would be the way to describe it, for businesses. The main group is businesses that these men were involved in while they were general authorities before 1933. And that number is about 1,600 businesses during the time that they were general authorities. Then I have another list of businesses when they were not general authorities, that they were involved either in before they became general authorities or after they became general authorities, in some cases because they were removed from office, in other cases because they just honorably were released. But in any event, it was not during a time when they were general authorities. And that's about 500 companies. So there are about 1,700 total in that number, close to 1,700, 1,750. And then there's a third category, and that is where the general authorities were involved, as far as I can determine, only financially in a company. And if they were involved in the management of the company, the records I've seen do not disclose that, and in many cases because in all but 3 counties that I mentioned in Utah, all that business records have are the articles of incorporation, and they don't have any of the bonds that were required at one time to be filed with the secretaries of state of every state in the union. At one time, I could have traced the officers and directorship over time in every company I looked at. But all of these, for record-keeping purposes and for storage purposes, it's a consistent pattern in every state of the union and in every county of Utah except 3 counties, Salt Lake County, Weber County, and Provo County, or Utah County, where Provo is located. All those counties in every state and all the other states of the union and all the secretaries of state in every state of the union destroyed all of those records that had one time been submitted except articles of incorporation and amendments to the articles of incorporation. And so these remaining 200 companies are those for which I can only demonstrate that the general authorities were involved as investors. They may have also been involved in corporate management, but I can't tell that because my findings in the companies is that many odd times a few weeks, a few months, a few years after a company was incorporated, a general authority became involved in its management. And for these 200 companies, the records don't exist to demonstrate that. Then I leapfrog. I couldn't do that kind of intensive research. Well, I could have, but I was too lazy to. For the full time period, I'm covering 180 years. So I leaped forward, and the next time I tried to do a survey of companies is in that talk that I gave at BYU, where I assessed in my research during that year general authorities who were involved in companies and business enterprises in 1983 and 84, either as officers or directors, or in some cases companies didn't have directors, they had trustees. But then I look at that, and then I leap forward again and look at the probated estates of general authorities. And up until 1992, Utah probate records continued to give deep financial details, but not after 1992. And even prior to that time, it was possible for the trustee of an estate or the executor of an estate to request an informal appraisal, which there was no permanent record kept of it. So the records, although they were beginning to diminish, they finally ended in 1992. And so what I showed was all of the general authorities who died from 1993 to 1992, 1933 to 1992, what do their probated estates show in terms of their bonds, their stocks, and in some cases other financial instruments that I mentioned briefly at their death. And so then it shows the nature of their investments as general authorities during that period from 1933 to 1992. And those are the only time periods that I can give a broad survey of the corporate behavior and corporate interest and corporate investments of the general authorities. And what I found two characteristics. In that earlier period, down to 1932, very few general authorities, in fact, really almost a handful, invested in companies that were not church-owned or Utah organized or within the Mormon culture region, centering on Utah. What I found in the period from 1933 to 1992 is that there was extensive investment in non-church and non-Utah, non-Mormon country businesses, typically national businesses and some multinational businesses by the general authorities. And so what I concluded was that as Mormonism moved into World War II, the 1950s, and beyond, both the corporate investments of the general authorities as persons and the corporate investments of the church as an institution became more secular and no longer were limited to the very close-knit kinds of companies that I described for that first century, when it was possible to have a cradle-to-grave association with companies that were directed by actively serving general authorities. From the 1970s onward in particular, that ended. And the church, both in investments and in control of companies, isolated its investments in very specific areas and no longer tried to either have a company or invest in companies in virtually every facet of the economy. So secularization is a part of the story that I'm looking at. The other part of business is the international growth of businesses. And I move in, particularly in the 20th century, but beginning even in the 1990s, looking at church-owned companies that are international in their outreach or international at their formation. And it's a part of this internationalization and secularization that's going on in the church. And so I'm not able to do the same kind of comprehensive survey that I did as late as the 1984 period, but I have been able to identify examples, prominent examples in Latin America, in Oceania, in Europe, of companies that are either heavily invested by or fully owned by the LDS Church. I can't look at stock ownership by individuals because, again, that would require me either to come into their homes and their offices and ask, would you please show me your stock portfolio, or to have access to their probated estates. And since the 1990s, those provide no financial data that is available to the public. So I can't say, all right, we not only have these church-owned companies that are national and international, but we have these investors among the general authorities. I can't look at that after 1992. But what I have found is that there is a very significant church investment of church funds across continents, and explain some of the nature of these. That some of them are for profit, others are not for profit. Then looking at tithing, I examined tithing revenues from 1890 to 2010, and from 1890 to the 1960s, I can give year-by-year statements of what the tithing was. After that, I project on the basis of the tithing revenues annually what the annual increase was during the 1950s. And that's a significant, I think, conservative measure, because that was the period in which there was a tremendous amount of poverty in the international church, and when the international church was expanding, so that missionaries were being sent into Asia and converting large numbers of people into Latin America and into the devastated parts of Europe that were being rebuilt, as well as Asia that were being rebuilt in the 1950s. And so that the growth of tithing on a percentage basis, I extrapolate from 1960 to 2010. And in the book, I give several measures about why I conclude that the increase, which during the 1950s averaged to 12.9% annual increase in tithing revenues, why that is, I think, still a conservative measure. But the result is that in a chart that I have, and I have several charts, as well as I have 19 charts, 17 charts and 21 appendixes. But this one chart deals with this projection of tithing from 1960 to 2010. And in 2010, it's $33 billion. And I think that's conservative.
Oh, wow.
And so the church has, in addition to that, it has corporate income from its for-profit businesses, and it has investment income from its stock portfolios. And I talk about the nature and the range of those, and I use internal sources for that. But these are not, I don't use anonymous sources. These are all named sources for the picture that I draw. And in some cases, I can only provide snapshots, like I say, snapshot of 83 to 84, snapshot of the 1990s, snapshot of 2010. In the earlier years, I can provide basically a motion picture of what the economic life of the church and its leaders were year by year by year, because I have that rich amount of data. But in the more recent time period, from the 1960s to the present, it's more snapshot version. The business income in 1901 to 02 provided about almost 18% of the church's total annual revenue. In the 1920s, it was 29% of the annual revenue. In the 1960s and again in the 1970s, Enneld and Tanner made statements, quotable statements, that the investment and business income of the church was about 40 to 45% of its total revenues. Well, if you choose one of those three and apply it to the $33 billion in 2010 and add on 18% as it was in 1902, or add on 28% extra as it was in 1928, or if you, as I think, the percentage has no reason for being less than how Nelton Tanner estimated in the 1960s and 1970s of 40 to 45% in addition to tithing. Then you add 40 to 45% on top of the 33%, not 33%, $33 billion. And then you'll have the additional corporate investment income, which will give you a good idea of what the church is receiving on an annual basis in the 21st century. Now, corporate Mormonism among many current Mormons is a bad term, is a negative term. I see it as a non-pejorative term, and I use it throughout the book. But I know that there has been, and many of you may have felt or have heard others express these same feelings, that when the church spends a $1.5 billion at a minimum on a City Creek Mall in Salt Lake City, upfront expenses, that this is religious commercialism run amok. And my argument in the book, in the last chapter, when I look at the international church and its revenues and its expenses, is that the church at its current status could not exist as it does internationally without this commercial income. I'll give you the reasons why. The country outside the United States that gets the least stipend in addition to its own tithing is Canada. And Canada, at certain years in the 21st century, and I have individual reporting for every year and I have a chart that measures this, or that specifies this. The church has given as little as 1 or 2% above the tithing gathered by Canadian saints for their expenses. The most most supplement that the church headquarters in Salt Lake has given to the church in Canada has been 6%. They are the country, the nation, least dependent on church headquarters to carry out the business of the church among Canadian Mormons. UK Mormons. On average, the UK church has required a 60% annual supplement in addition to its tithing. And that country we have been as a church in since 1837. And it is an industrial country. It is a middle-class country. And many of the Mormons there, while some are poor, many of the Mormons there are middle class. And yet LDS headquarters has needed to supplement their tithing revenues by an average of 60%. And 1 year, the supplement that Salt Lake City sent to England was nearly $500 million for 1 year, for one country, an industrial country. Now look at the third world. In the Philippines, the LDS Church has provided during the 20th century on an annual basis between 94 and 98% of its expenses. The Filipino Mormons cannot. They are barely able to put food on the table. In other countries, third world countries, this is the same. If it weren't for this massive, and I think it's fair to call it massive revenue, income that the church receives from its stock and bond portfolios, and I say portfolios because they're scattered among many investment companies, and it's for-profit businesses. Without that supplement to what American Mormons, U.S. Mormons, pay as tithing, there could not be the international church that there currently is, and it certainly couldn't grow. And so, for whatever comfort it may have, I think two non-Mormon writers in 1984 got it exactly right when they said that when it comes down to the basics, the LDS Church is in business, but it is in the business of building the kingdom of God. And that is a spiritual entity and a spiritual mission that ultimately has only spiritual aims. And so, yes, the church has always been in business. The business of the church since the 1830s has been business. But it is a business that plows the money back to the degree it can. Sometimes it's come near bankruptcy over its businesses. But when they have been profitable, it has plowed those profits back into building the kingdom of God. And that leads to church salaries. And I'll summarize this, and I deal only with general authorities. In the Extensions of Power book, I talked about stake presidencies and patriarchs, local patriarchs and bishops, and the kinds of remuneration that they were receiving or were not receiving during the 19th century in particular, and which ended basically in the early decades of the 20th century. But this book, Welcome Power, focuses only on the general authorities and their living allowances, sometimes called salaries, and I call them both, living allowances or remuneration and salaries. In the 19th century, and they really did not become standardized until the 1877. From 1877, for nearly a century, for 90 years, they were stratified according to your echelon. So the president of the church received the most, his counselors received the next most, senior members of the 12 the next most, junior members of the 12 apostles the next most. Sometimes presiding bishop got the next, that varied over time. But then usually below the remuneration of the presiding bishop and his counselors was the Council of 70, which was presided over until 1976 by 7 men. And then consistently, aside from Hiram Smith as church patriarch in the 1840s, after Hiram Smith was murdered with Joseph Smith, the church patriarch always got the least, without any argument. I mean, every measure that you can come up with, he was always at the bottom. Then in 1966, David O. McKay finalized a process that had been going on during the administrations of his two predecessors of equalizing. The process was equalizing the remuneration. And from the late 1960s to the present, every general authority who's working full-time for the church, whether it's the president of the church or the newest general authority appointed, receives the same. And in addition to those amounts, or that amount, that standard amount since the late 1960s, some, not all, but many general authorities also got extra money on top of that from their corporate boards, where they were directors of companies or officers of companies. That began ending in 1976 when President of Church Spencer W. Kimball began withdrawing from those positions. It ended for everybody 20 years later, in 1996. So the general authorities, with one major exception, do not get corporate appointments that have corporate income connected with them. And that exception is the presiding bishopric, because their function is almost entirely financial and corporate. And so they continue to have extensive roles as directors, trustees, or officers of companies, many of which are nonprofit, others of which are for-profit. But they are the only exception. The other general authorities, if they get anything extra, it's through books they publish, and these are like contracts that any rank and file Mormon would get with Desert Book. And if they have a good seller, then they're going to get several thousands of dollars. The only time that I got the amount of royalties that a general authority earned was from the much published Joseph Fielding Smith when he died in 1972. And the 6-month total of his royalty check from Deseret Book when he died in 1972 was $6,000. Now that was a lot of money in 1972, but it wasn't enough to live on its own. And so I imagine that that has followed the inflation rate, so it would go up to higher amount, 5 figures probably, for some general authorities who have a number of books that are selling and have sold well. They might get a 5-figure amount in royalties. But if some 5-year convert to the church had a book with Deseret Book that sold as many copies as the general authority, they wouldn't get any more than the general authority did. So that's a kind of a retail reality that people who take the time and make the effort to publish can get if their books are good sellers. And not all of the general authority books are, but there is a kind of a built-in readership who are willing and eager to buy those. And so those general authorities that you see as authors have contracts and they receive money, and more than pin change, but not enough to live on. And aside from that, there are no perks that I'm aware of that the general authorities have ever gotten since the 1960s except free cars. And the wealthy car dealers in Utah, and that used to be the original Garf, and I can't remember his first name, but Milton Garf, maybe that was his name, in the 1960s provided cars to all the general authorities who could benefit from having a car. But some of them are independently wealthy. I know that Tanner was a multimillionaire who became a general authority. So was Henry D. Moyle. And they didn't even accept their monthly living allowance. They didn't need it. And that's true of wealthy general authorities today. But I won't name names, but one of the members of the 12 took a 60% hit in his salary when he became a general authority. And according to his brothers, who I've spoken with, he lives in a very modest home. It's one he bought. No one bought it for him. It's one he bought from his own earnings, which earnings decreased by 60% when he became a general authority and accepted that position. So the final evidence that I mentioned was in the newspaper were the payment pay stubs for a member of the Quorum of the 12 in 1999. And Jan Ships, who's a frequent non-Mormon writer and commentator about Mormonism, expressed more than mild surprise. She was stunned at how low the remuneration was in 1999. And their comment was that there are college and junior college presidents who make far more than the general authorities who at that high level apostles were making in 1999, according to the pay stubs. Then a letter from a financial officer in 2014 indicated that the standardized salary was increased as of that year to $120,000 for each general authority, from the president of the church down to the most recently appointed full-time general authority. Well, I can demonstrate that these prophets, seers, and revelators, as of 2014, when they got a bump to 120,000 dollars a year for their living allowance, had authorized the top bureaucrats being paid by either the corporation of the president or corporation of the presiding bishop, depending on how you fit within that umbrella financially, that the top administrator in Canada during that time period was earning more than twice what the apostles were receiving and all the first presidency was receiving in 2014. This is a truly extraordinary. I was stunned when I saw those figures and made that comparison, that a rank and file Mormon who is a highly placed bureaucrat within the church administrative structure, which they don't like being called a bureaucracy, but which is, that he can make more than double what prophets, seers, and revelators who approved his salary are making, I think is stunning. And to me, it's faith-promoting. So I look at this overview that I give you in the book, and there is nothing in American society to compare to it. It is a success story in America without parallel. Because here you have a church, or if you want to compare it to a secular organization, all of whose assets were confiscated by the federal government for a 10-year period. And then, every 20 to 30 years after those assets were returned in the 1890s, went to the brink of bankruptcy for different reasons, but that was a pattern. About every 20 or 30 years, the church was just about ready to collapse financially. And that last such case occurred in the early 1960s, when by 1963, the church officers in the finance department didn't think they could make the payroll here and for church employees in Salt Lake. That was how grim it was. It wasn't that the church didn't have assets. It had millions of dollars worth of assets, but they were fixed assets. They couldn't be used to pay the immediate obligations, including salaries, that the church owed other people, including its employees. That was how desperate the situation was when Eldon Tanner took over the reins of church finance, and he transformed it. And within 6 years, the church was in a cash excess basis. He had been able to make that turnaround that fast. And so now that you have a church that is worth, in its terms of its income, now I'm not talking about expenditures, because those could equal income, particularly from tithing. But in terms of income, when you have a tithing and a financial investment, for-profit business income in the tens of billions of dollars in the 21st century, there's no other institution that can describe or experience or boast about that kind of a trajectory. Going from having virtually all but $50,000 worth of its assets confiscated by the federal government in 1887 to the 1894, when it was returned, that time period, to one crisis financially after another until the church was about every 2 or 3 decades near bankruptcy, just kind of living hand to mouth to get enough tithing income to fulfill its needs and to bank some for the next disaster, to where it is now, where the church can spend $1.5 billion up front for a commercial investment in Salt Lake City, where it can send $500 million in 1 year to help an industrial country with its expenses, one country of around 110, in which there are significant organizations and numbers of Mormonism. I don't think there's anything that can compare to it as in a success story. So from my point of view, although whenever you're dealing with money, whenever you're dealing with corporate power, there are potential abuses and actual abuses. That's just the nature of the free enterprise system. And one reason Brigham Young condemned it in 1875 with his Quorum of the 12 Apostles and his counselors. And so that's inevitable. That, there are going to be shadows within all these bright spots that I've tried to emphasize about this financial and corporate history of Mormonism for 180 years. But in my view, it's not only a remarkable, unparalleled American success story, it's also faith promoting. And with that, I'll turn it over for whatever comments or questions you all have.
Yeah, we should record Q&A, unless is anybody uncomfortable with, okay.
Don't ask an embarrassing question. I'm not easily embarrassed, but if you don't want to be identified with the question, then don't ask it.
I'll start if you want.
Go ahead.
So the church would, at its general conferences, would give a financial report as well as publish that report in, I think it was in the improvement era.
Well, no, it published it in the what was called the conference report, which was an official verbatim report of everything that occurred at the conference. Whereas in the periodicals of the church, under different names, those conference accounts typically only involved sermons that were given during and not always all sermons, but in generally most of the sermons, and then a brief statistical report, which was much shorter than the financial reports.
So when did the financial reports end? For what reason?
They ended in 1959, and they ended because the church was beginning deficit spending.
This was Moyle's project mostly?
And by deficit spending, I'm not saying they spent more money than they had. What deficit spending means is that you're spending more in a year than your resources, your assets, or not assets, than your income during that year. And you don't need to be borrowing to do deficit spending. You can be drawing on cash reserves that you've got in savings or in a suitcase under your bed or whatever. But if in fact you cannot pay your immediate expenses without borrowing, then you're in a position that could move into bankruptcy. But the church was deficit spending. It wasn't spending more than it had, it was spending more than it had received. And it couldn't move many of these large blocks of land, which had great wealth attached to them, in fast enough to provide, for example, the wages for its employees in 1963. It was that close to a cash flow crisis. And that's really what it was. It wasn't bankruptcy. But most bankruptcies involve cash flow crises. That the individual or the corporation has assets that are fixed that cannot be used to pay its immediate debts. And so bankruptcy is the only response that an individual or a company can use. And so in the sale of assets, very often a company or an individual would come out ahead. But at a certain point, they had to apply to a court for assistance, and that's what bankruptcy is all about. In the best outcomes, the sale of fixed incomes is able to pay all the immediate obligations, and the individual or the corporation has something left over. But not always is that the case, and then sometimes those to whom money is owed only get pennies on the dollar. Anyway, the church wasn't bankrupt. It was in a cash flow crisis, and it was in deficit spending. And that's why those reports ended in 1959. Now, those reports, in only 1 year, only in 1915, did they include tithing. And that was the only published financial report that included the annual tithing received. All the rest of them, the annual reports that were published as part of the General Conference in April, they provided statements of expenditures. And it was anyone's guess what the income was. But typically, there was a statement made that the church is not in debt. And that was a kind of pro forma statement that the financial committee made every year. These statements of expenditures came out, so that the church was spending less than it had, and less typically than it received. And when it could no longer say that, after 1959 under Moyle, then it stopped those financial reports.
There's a fear of panic, do you think? Or?
Because they no longer could say we are spending within our income as consistently as they've been able to before. So that's the situation. But there is some misunderstanding about those reports, because I think there's a general assumption about people who know there was such reporting that reporting included tithing annually, and it did not.
So they were only so useful anyway.
Right.
So, go ahead.
What would you think would happen if they started reporting the financials, say, at this next general conference? What do you think the general membership would?
I think if they provided a streamlined report, and even at the largest reports, and I give an example in the book, was 1949, and it was in printed form in the conference report. It was 14 pages of figures, which were read out in a droning voice to the thousands of people in the conference, in the tabernacle, who just, tried to stay awake as all these numbers and categories of expenditure were being laid out. If they provided a detailed report, even streamlined, I think after the initial shock of seeing billions of dollars, I think members would recognize, and if they didn't recognize it immediately, a spokesperson could clarify this for them, that these billions of dollars of income, which I think ideally should be reported publicly, are what make the billions of dollars of expenditures even possible. And that particularly regarding the international church, whose expenditures I think should be separated from the expenditures for Canada and North America and the United States. I think everything outside Canada and the United States ought to be itemized separately from the expenditures for Canada and the United States. I think general members would be able to see that if it weren't for the added income of the business and investments, that international church would dry up.
So follow-up question, were you done with that? And can the microphone pick up our questions okay, or do we need to repeat them? Or we're okay. To follow up on this balance between tithing and donations versus corporate investments and corporate business income, if you can elaborate a little bit, Mike, on a couple of things. Would you say that basically those are the two main categories of income for the church? It's it's businesses from the beginning, since 1830, various businesses and their profits and their interest and, all of the aspects of income that come out of business, versus donations, people giving of their goods, their time, and then later tithing. In this other category, members, donations, are those essentially it? And then on that balance, is it true, the statement, I can't remember if it was cost, and if it was, the balance was that somehow tithing really did make a difference, and that 50% of the debt was paid off, but then later I heard you say that it was much later that it came to.
Well, no, what Clausen said was that in 3 years of Lorenzo Snow's, or 3 years since Lorenzo Snow's emphasis on Mormons paying tithing, during that 3-year period, they'd paid off half of the church indebtedness.
Okay.
And that he had estimated that it would take only 3 more years by projecting the previous values, which I've done in that projection from 1960 to 2010. He was projecting, if we continue to receive the tithing that we received up to 2003, the church will be completely out of debt by 1906, and it was.
Okay, and so the tithing, that new program of tithing really did make a massive difference in enabling them to pay off 50%. Meanwhile, the companies, they were in process of building companies and trying to generate revenue. Can you comment or elaborate?
Most of those companies drained the church's revenues.
Okay.
Because many of those companies, not all, CCMI being a primary example of a very successful company. ZCMI was Zion's Cooperative Mercantile Institution. It was the church's department store from 1868 until the church sold it in the 1990s. But I believe it was 1990s. I'm a little bit foggy on that. But I have it in a book, but right now I'm foggy on it. That was successful, highly successful. But there were many businesses that were highly speculative, mines in particular, precious metals mines, silver mines, gold mines, that the church invested in from the 1880s onward. Those drained the church's revenues, and there were huge losses from those. And the church debt that they were so concerned about paying off, more than 80% of it was from these speculative investments. It was not from government confiscation.
Wow.
That was a very small portion of the debt that just nearly strangled the church in the 1890s and the early 1900s. It was, in fact, the going south of these speculative investments that the church had made primarily in mining companies.
Okay, so final follow-up to that whole thing, and then I know you've got a question and other questions. At what point did the church company's business side, all these companies that have been developed and all of their related business incomes, at what point did they start providing a higher percentage of the church's overall income as compared to tithing? And then can you summarize, you kind of did earlier, but I wanted to kind of accentuate it a little more, summarize how that has evolved in the 20th century, the percentage of income from business versus donations.
I can't give you that clearly. Okay. I just as indicated that there's a range of percentages that you can give. And the most recent presiding bishop, I can't even remember his name, Bishop Burton, estimated that about 10% in the 90s, he said 10% of the church's annual revenue comes from business and investments. I find that to be a great understatement, since in 1900 and 1902 it was almost 18%.
Right.
And it kept every few decades later, when there was some independent measure from within the church of how much that was, it was almost double each time. So I think that's a lowball estimate, 10%. But even if you acknowledge 10%, that's we're still talking about tens of billions of dollars annually coming from the businesses and investments. I need to make one qualification, and that is that, and the names of these businesses have changed since the 1970s. But in the 1970s, there were businesses that were established to manage trusts that were donated primarily by non-Mormons to BYU and then later to church headquarters. So those are donations, but they're donating to a corporation which is itself nonprofit. So that when that corporation and the names change, Desert usually is a part of it, but that has varied over the years, over the decades. When those assets are sold and the profits plowed back into the nonprofit, which is owned wholly by the church, those originated originally with donations, but they're a part of the corporate not wealth, but income of the church, because they were funneled through a corporation and they're managed through a corporation. And so I don't know if church headquarters defines these in that same way, but for me it's easier not to include those as voluntary donations, since they are made in the same way that people donate money for a tax write-off to a museum or to a university. That becomes part of the operating revenue of that organization, and that's true of this church. And those kinds of trusts are managed by corporations, even though they're nonprofit corporations.
Business practice. Okay.
So Mike, you've talked about the tithing flow of money going to the church, and then the corporate flow of money and investments, and then there's and that goes primarily, as I understand it, to do the general operating costs of the church. We also have tithes and or offerings, fast offerings, and there's humanitarian expenditures that go. The humanitarian expenditures, I believe, help non-Mormons, and fast offerings help Mormons. And Elder Oaks recently said, I believe, if I recall correctly, that there were $40 million a year spent on humanitarian efforts. Can you kind of encapsulate that side of things?
Well, yeah, and it goes to one of the criticisms that I quote, where critics of the City Creek Mall, and most of these are devout members of the church who have been disillusioned by the public acknowledgments of the money that went into that investment. And one of them was quoted in not in Business Week, it was quoted in the Salt Lake Tribune, and it was quoted in one of the major financial resources, both digital and print versions. And it was a young man's comment that the church spent more on the mall in 3 years than it did in humanitarian aid over 20. And that was based on a financial report issued by church headquarters itself, which stated the amount of money given to humanitarian aid during that time period. The problem is that was cash. And my guess is that 20 to 30 times greater in-kind property or in-kind donation to emergency relief was given in the form of blankets, canned goods, clothing, medication, things that are distributed by what Mormons call the welfare plan. And those things are given to areas, countries where possible, as soon as the church can deliver them. Now, there are countries in the world where the church doesn't have a distribution network, and so very often in those countries, and maybe exclusively in those countries, the church has written checks. And it's that cash amount that has been identified as being the total humanitarian outlay of the church during a 20-year period. And although it's based on an official report, it does not describe in any sense the full picture, because the full picture includes all the donated time, all the production of clothing, blankets, and many other kinds of things, as well as food, that the welfare program in its many directions internationally now can provide. So I think the humanitarian side of the church's giving is, if he said 40 million a year, then he's probably quoting from a report of which he knows from church financial department. And I think that, that should be trotted out. And I wasn't able, either I didn't know about it or it came too late for that to make it into the book. I wish it could have, because I think that's a great corrective to this assumption that many have made, both Mormon and non-Mormon, that figure released in terms of humanitarian aid meant the total amount, and it doesn't.
Okay, and to clarify, I've heard this, but I don't know if there's any factuality behind it, that tithing monies are not used to help members of the church in need, that it's strictly fast offerings. Do you know how that division is made, and with the humanitarian, or
in detail? No, I can't claim to know that, and I don't get into that precise. Even during the period when I had the figures at my disposal, I simply didn't take notes on those, or photocopies on those kinds of reports, because they were just too much in the thickets of finance, and I didn't want to go that deeply.
Right.
So I went and looked at the statements of total revenues, and then the published statements of total expenditures during the period up to and including 1959.
So incidentally, the gentleman that you quoted in your book, I know him, and so I let him know that you had cited him, and he said he was just thrilled that he'd made it into your book. In fact, it brought him to tears to know that he was cited in your book.
Come on. That's sweet. Yeah, not everyone is pleased when I quote them. I've quoted people who have made it their private statements to me in interviews and have authorized me to quote them, or they're in the print media,
Right.
and this is legitimate, and they gave their statements to reporters knowing that it was going to be in the public domain. So I don't use anonymous sources in the book. I felt that would be an unnecessary vulnerability for criticism. And so everything I cite from written material, some of which is not available currently to the general public, except in my own research papers at Yale University. And those research papers are open to the public. And the financial material, some of which is handwritten, but most of the internal material, because I felt the need to at the time, that was one of the few documents I photocopied when I examined those documents. And so those documents of the internal financial reports are photocopied for the most part. Okay, I think we're at the end, and I've certainly taken up your evening.
Well, we've
Thank
got
you.
a couple more.
Oh, okay,
We've got
sorry.
a couple more questions. So you've got a question, I don't know if you do, and then I've got one more to.
When I heard about the paper that leaked the pay that the channel reporters received, what bothered me the most about it was, I have no problem with them getting a stipend. Of course they need a living stipend, etc. And I have no problem with that. I think the problem I had with it most was that we then turn around and say we don't have a paid clergy, mean, let's be honest about it.
Yeah, and that's something that began with the church's newspaper in 1836, which made this barrage against traditional Christianity's hireling priests. And I talk about what the Revelations themselves had already said about the church leaders, that the laborer is worthy of his hire, and that it was such an irony. I mean, it was casting stones at Protestants because they had, yes, a paid ministry, but it wasn't acknowledging the fact that the Revelations themselves, that in the 1830s, authorized a paid ministry at the highest levels, where it was full time, and yet missionaries didn't get paid. Local officers, as they expanded in numbers, they didn't get paid.
Yeah.
So we can say at the local level, but yeah, at the highest levels there has been remuneration.
I think the other interesting thing about it, I'm not sure what to make of it, because we seem to have just slightly different priorities than other churches, and when I look at the way the money is spent, it's debatable how much of it as a whole is spent towards humanitarian aid as opposed to investment in things that will get us through dark times in the future. I can see where they would go, okay, there may be a time when we don't get tithing, so we need to get through that. Okay, I can see that. That makes sense. We're a very business-minded church, very practical when it comes to finances now. Seem to have learned our lesson from the previous century. And I guess what came to mind was that a church, a congregation down in Texas that wouldn't let people in during the flood. And it's this palace of ostentatiousness, and the preacher for that, he has a jet, he has a mansion, and they preach the gospel of prosperity, which the church preaches too, to a certain extent. But I see very few, and partly this is the result of the dynamic of the lay ministry. We don't have monuments to individual leaders in the church, other than names on buildings at BYU. And the church really, I mean, people say it's a fraud, but when you really look at what it spends its money on, it's, they build chapels to last forever. And I mean forever. So it's like they're thinking, we're in this for the long haul. And a huge amount is built, either money or effort is built on the intangible, like temples. I mean, temples you don't get anything out of temples. You don't get converts. You might, if you build a chapel or something, you might get more people in as converts, but temples are very spiritually oriented. And a huge amount of effort goes into this intangible ordinance. And then there's also buying land in Missouri, and maybe this from a minimal amount of perspective, clearly they see their work as the work of God and consecrated and focused on some very spiritually oriented activities. I mean, you said obviously there's waste and some bad things they do with it and mistakes, but from an outsider's perspective, I'd like to know how you see this. It looks like they're at least trying to use the money well.
Yeah.
And not just blow it on monuments to themselves or frivolous.
Right, and that's why I dole out a fair amount of praise for the authors Robert Gottlieb and Peter Wiley, Jew and a Protestant, in their analysis of Mormonism in 1984, where they said that you look at this business empire, you look at this company, a wealthy church, as of they were aware of in 1984, when they had very extensive interviews with the church's chief investment officer at the time. And they said, you have to recognize that the church is in business of building the church. And it has a gospel, a spiritual purpose and goal, and that's what they're about. They're not about making money to make money. They're making money to make converts. They're making money to make baptismal fonts and to build temples and to aid the poor, and not only their own poor, but in emergencies, anyone's poor in any country of any religious denomination who may inhabit that area where there is an emergency. And so, I think that there's not, I'm a socialist. I've been a democratic socialist since I came back from my mission and realized that all the fun I've been making of the British socialist system was making fun of a system that was designed to do everything I felt the Book of Mormon taught us to do, and that Jesus and the New Testament taught us to do. And I from age 22 on, I've been a democratic socialist. But in my position, I see nothing wrong with wealth. And I see nothing wrong with free enterprise and capitalism, as long as you have the power of government controlling it, regulating it. And that was the huge absence that Brigham Young and his counselors in the Quorum of the 12 bemoaned in 1875, was that you have this massive accumulation of wealth in the hands of a very few, and no safeguards against its misuse, and no controls on the economy benefiting more than just a few. And so I'm along the lines of a Swedish socialist. I have nothing against wealth, nothing against millionaires, just spread the wealth around. And I think that attitude, for me, allows me as a socialist, I'm not a Marxist, but as a socialist, to see this story of the Mormon Church as a very positive story and a faith-promoting story. Because there is not an effort to aggrandize wealth for these 15 men who are at the very top of this organization. They live very modestly. They receive an extraordinarily modest living allowance by comparison to some of the top administrators in their bureaucracy.
The fact that they are no longer allowed on these boards, I'm sure, cut into their pay.
It did, and I traced that out. That presidents of the church, for example,
Kimball that started getting them off.
No, it was President Kimball. I think you said Hinckley. Yes, it was President Kimball.
Okay.
But the process wasn't completed until 1996, and that was under President Hinckley.
Could I draw a comparison here and see if you agree with this? So we look at some of the more successful big box retail stores like Walmart versus how Costco operates, right? And the Wall family or the Walton family, whatever their name is, multi-billionaires, pays their employees extremely poorly, well known for their political ties and feeding money into lobbyism and political entities that will continue to give them tax shelters and whatnot. Versus you look at Costco with a CEO that receives a modest stipend for what that company is worth, relatively speaking, pays his employees extremely well, has very relatively low turnover, offers great benefit packages, and is involved in tremendous philanthropy and humanitarian aid, also puts a lot of money into politics. But if you look at those two models out in the world, it seems to me like what you're showing is that the church, at least as a secular institution, seems to be more on the side of Costco.
Oh, I think without doubt.
And we cheer on, particularly those of us on the left, we cheer on Costco as a phenomenal model of doing business, and we ardently reject the Walmart way of doing business. Yet what I see amongst church members, and I think this is out of ignorance, what I see amongst particularly disaffected church members is that we treat the church as Walmart. We treat it as the Walton family getting mega bucks and being, oppressive towards its own people while investing in political favoritism, and we don't see it as the Costco model. And I think that what you're arguing is if we gave them the financial picture and what they were able to really see, that maybe it would change the perception.
That's my view, and I think that ultimately, full disclosure within limits. I mean, you can't give a total CPA report to the general public and expect them to understand it. But if they provided the kind of generally understandable categories and dollars and cents that the early reports used to provide for expenditures, and provide that both for 21st century income as well as expenditures, and in particular, I think, to show the difference between income and expenditures for the international church versus Canada and the United States, I think members of the church would, after they had time to reflect on it, see this as a story that they want to shout from the rooftops. That this is a story of an institution that is so wealthy that it can spend this amount of money, $1.5 million, acknowledged, more than that actually, on a mall, but also can send $500,000 or $500 million, nearly $500 million in 1 year to benefit the saints of an industrial country who cannot afford to pay their own expenses in terms of tithing, and send 95% or 98% of the expenses of a third world country like the Philippines from the tithing of those who have the money to donate to the church.
I think you said Tonga was nearly 100%, wasn't it?
Well, they're both. Tonga and the Philippines are both in the 90% range. And Tonga claims half of its membership is Mormon.
Half of its population.
Half of its population, as Mormon.
Right.
Whereas in the Philippines, it's 600,000 of a much larger population. But the Philippines is far poorer than Tonga.
Right.
And the number of economic studies show that the Filipinos only have enough money on an average income to buy one meal a day. I mean, they are virtually on the edge of starvation.
Some major social stratification in the Philippines.
So I really feel that disclosure, although it's contrary to more recent decades of church policy, I think that would be a welcome change for the membership generally, and I think the effect of it would be positive.
Well, to follow up on that, I perhaps one fear is that leaders fear that members and critics will simply look at numbers and not know how to interpret them and misinterpret them.
That's true. I mean,
and they need the context. They need the kind of historical context and the comparative context with other corporations and their practices and salaries, and the Walmart versus Costco, plus other churches even, and how their salaries and their monies are spent. So they need. Can you comment on that? They need. They need the context and the comparison.
Well, the danger, I think, of a report being misunderstood by the general public is in the example is clearly the one about the amount of money given by the church for humanitarian aid over a 20-year period. And the figures are accurate. It's just that they don't tell the whole story.
Right.
But people are left with the conclusion this is all the church has given for humanitarian aid in a 20-year period.
Right.
And the reality is far different from that. So I would go back to the example of J. Reuben Clark, who was the one who was the counselor with responsibility for church finances from about 1935 to 1951. And for that period of time, when he would read very often, not always, but very often, he would read the financial report to the April General Conference. But even if he wasn't the one who would read it, he would talk about the meaning of the financial report.
Right.
And he would talk about the efforts of the church leaders to spend within their income and not to build palaces like you were talking about for meeting houses, not to build crystal cathedrals, but instead to build useful, practical buildings so that we can do this for everybody, not just the people who have the income to support it. And so that's what I think is necessary, that in addition to the reports, that you have somebody like a counselor in the First Presidency or an apostle to devote a talk at each conference that gives out this report to lay the context for the report.
Yeah, to give the kind of context and meaning and interpretation that, say, Reverend Clark gave, or that you give in this book. I think that's one of the big contributions of your book, in addition to just the amazing amount of data and research, is the sense that you make, the context and the comparative, the contextual and the comparative sense that you make that comes through in the chapters. Because if you're just reading information and you don't know what to make of it, you really don't know how to interpret it. But the way that the depth of the context and the meaning and the comparisons that you're making of the data with different years and different figures and different aspects really makes a big difference. It's a very, it's a complex, demanding read, but it's very, very revealing. I mean, there are the lows and the highs. The low moment, and I'd like you to comment on this, the low moment, at least for me, was seeing that Brigham Young was hoarding money and that he had $1 million when he died, you know. I mean, he's the big hoarder. He's the one who did take more than he should have, but then, you know.
Wasn't he trying to hide it from the feds, though? Wasn't that
No,
part of it?
they separated.
Yeah.
Well, and he was the trustee in trust for the church as well at the time.
Yeah.
But he was criticized by his own.
He was.
So.
But there are lows and highs in that story.
Yeah,
So-
and that, you know, as a historian, that's what I have to present. I have to present the whole picture, and if there's an outhouse in the panorama, there's one of those pictures of Nauvoo. In the center of that famous picture of Nauvoo residences with the temple on the hill, there's an outhouse, not front, but center in that, and that was often scrubbed out of the reprints of that original photograph. But, you know, it's too bad, because that's a part of life, and the part of dollars and cents and business transactions is that there are things you can be proud of and things that you might not be proud of. Church-owned companies sometimes engaged in ruthless competition in Utah and undersold even its costs in order to drive competitors out of business. And so the abuses that you can find in capitalism generally sometimes find, you know, the rats find places to, you know, invade the temple. I mean, the temple is not free from these kinds of influences that are a part of human life. But I think still, on balance, there are far more lights in this story than there are shadows. But where I've run across the shadows, I've presented them within the context that I try to present the positive things. That, you know, not everything is positive, and it's not maybe as positive as our PR people would like to make it seem. But nonetheless, it's positive. And the negative things, yes, they're there, but maybe they're not as negative as some of the most severe critics have presented.
Well, the positive side of the story comes through when you contextualize it and point out what an amazing miracle and success story it is, what the church actually accomplished in spite of its debts, in spite of its problems, in spite of having its assets seized by the government, in spite of the failures of so many businesses. I mean, when you give that overall context and picture, that's extremely informative and inspiring to realize that the church was able to amass the amount of money and equity and profit that it was in the 20th century. It is, and I guess that this would be my question, do you see a divine hand in that? Do you see it as somehow they were aided? You know, that's a story that maybe shouldn't have happened, and it's kind of a miraculous story. I mean, does it sort of suggest that there was some, I don't know, higher divine spiritual aid in that for that?
Well, when you look at the experience of well-intended people, good people, who, whether they're parents in a family, or they're administrators of a school, or they're leaders of a church, or they're rulers in a country, it's easy to identify the people in the black hats. But the people that you would say, yes, this is a well-intentioned person, she is a well-intentioned leader of this charity or of this business, whatever, you can still see that there are not only mistakes, but sometimes really bad mistakes that even a well-intentioned person can make. And with those speculative investments that I talked about that just drove the church to near bankruptcy by the early 1900s, those were well-intentioned, and those were investments that the president of the church promoted contrary to the wishes of the general authorities under him, primarily in the quorum of the 12 apostles who opposed those kinds of investments. He saw this as a way of giving the Lord the opportunity to pull the church out of its debt fast. And unfortunately, the Lord doesn't intervene every time we want him to, even in life and death situations. And certainly with the profitability of an investment, the Lord, I think, rarely intervenes. So I see that the positiveness and the negativeness of the financial and business history of the church is, both of those are consequences of well-intentioned people doing the best they can with the faith they have that God will see them through the thickets of the decisions they have to make in a positive way. But if God answered every prayer we asked with yes, then no one would be unhappy, no one would be poor, no one would die, no one would be sick. So it's a part of what Mormons call the dark and wasted spaces of the mortal experience. That we're here to experience mortality in all of its horrors, as well as in its occasional lights and bursts of happiness. That's true financially. And the church has gone through horrific experiences financially, as well as, send up flags and skyrockets to celebrate. So I don't want to say that God was responsible for the near bankruptcies of the church, nor that God was responsible for what I see as a financial miracle since the 1960s. I see that as people drawing on God, asking God for inspiration to help them to do their best as fallible human beings in their financial decisions. And many of those have turned out. However, even though Eldon Tanner was and has been frequently called the financial wizard of the modern church, when in his estate he died with tens of thousands of dollars of worthless stocks that he had invested in that had no value monetarily when he died. So even his best financial wizardry did not always work out.
That's interesting.
So I just want to make one comment about the book itself, and I think who here has seen the book yet? Have you?
Yeah,
Probably just you and
I've
I.
been reading.
Mike, have you seen your book yet?
I have.
I want to thank you for letting Ron Prittis persuade you to write the narrative interpretation in that book. Had it been published as just the appendixes now, I think it would have been an overwhelming amount of data for a lot of readers to try to digest and interpret on their own, and probably would have come to a lot of different conclusions than perhaps what you were hoping.
Yeah, I was thinking of writing a 10-page introduction, and that was going to be it.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, I'm
And
glad
Ron
that
just said nothing doing, and you know, I was wrong and he was right. That Signature would have made a mistake in creating an addendum to the 2-volume hierarchy books that I wrote of just a book on business, and that's what I wanted to call it, the Mormon Hierarchy Businesses before 1933. That's what I wanted to title it.
Yeah.
And it would have been, you know, a very narrow book.
Like a directory.
It would have been like a directory, and it would have been a mistake. I was just too close and too tired of the drudgery of doing this financial and business research to see it. And he saw it from the point of view of what's in the best interest of Signature Books, of the publisher. And that worked out to my best interest too, and I hope to the readers.
Well, it does help the readers because it's those 3 chapters that give us the historical context and give us the sense of, I mean, those 3 chapters are just filled with wonderful information that I've been going through for my own projects. And the context that they give and the survey and the meaning that it makes out of all that information is profound. I can't imagine that book without those 3 chapters.
Yeah.
Well, I think
the problem was I could.
I can't imagine.
I think it actually helps also mitigate some of the potential outrage that some people may have otherwise incurred just from seeing raw data numbers. And not being able to put it into any sort of a context of why this is not such a negative thing. By the end of your 3rd chapter, you make it pretty clear that this is a story to be proud of, and a remarkable accomplishment. And I think that that's the most significant part of your book, in my opinion.
Well, thank you.
How many appendices do you have?
21.
Oh, 21.
So just a few.
It's 1 page long. One of them is 280 pages long.
I was going to ask you to name the titles of all of them.
No, I
Don't
won't.
bother with that. Okay, well,
But I include individual emphasis where I list them according to individual. And then I also include business emphasis where I organize them according to company name. And then I also include nation emphasis where I look at 6 English-speaking countries, at least where their reports are submitted in English. Philippines is multilingual, but I have those as well. So it's both institutional and personal and international in emphasis.
This is a book that no one else could write, no one else ever could have. The church wouldn't provided this information. No one could have done this but you. And it's the only way.
No one has but me. I'm not sure that it's fair to say no one could have, but for whatever reason, I'm just a dog with a bone when it comes to history. And instead of burying it, I want to unbury it. I want to uncover it and share it with the world instead of hoarding it for myself, which some historians like doing. Not me. I would rather keep it long enough to percolate, but then when it's ready, I want to have it out and have it as a smorgasbord.
Yeah.
So it's something that the book would not have been possible if I hadn't had this laser kind of patience and attention to detail and a willingness to spend, it's just hard to say, 42 years working on it.
as long as the children of Israel remember to
And then some.
So you finally made it to the promised land now.
I
The
made
book
it
is
to the
done.
promised
It's
land.
off the-
It's-
it's
And I
off-
will cradle that bound book like a baby when I
like a
get it.
baby. There are a couple of last questions. Claire, you had it?
No, I asked my questions.
Any others? I had one final question, of course. I always have lots of questions and comments. Any other questions before? Okay, well, you knew I had to bring this up, right? The woman question. So women in church finance and companies, and it's really interesting that, there's this glaring absence of women in any of those boards and committees, and women are not much there in the story. We have Emma Smith filing a financial report on the Relief Society. And then you've got Eliza R. Snow, who is, she has a small, it counts as, you count it as a company, and I love it, her school, the Eliza R. Snow School. And, just very few. I mean, you kind of have to fast forward then to the future, and there isn't much. And then today, you've got Sharon Eubank, who is she's the director of LDS Charities, and she established a committee of the Relief Society presidency, which she also serves on, and the presiding bishopric, and the two together form this company that oversees charities. But do you want to comment on the absence of women in this story, and sort of maybe a hopeful future with this current situation with Sharon Eubank, who I see as kind of a person whose her role is kind of changing in this?
Well, I was able to include women in the first two volumes for significant reasons. Joseph Smith gave women a significant role in Nauvoo, and I was able to emphasize that, and the role that women had in the campaign that he ran for the presidency of the United States, where women were involved in giving the authorization for him to do that.
Yeah.
And of course his plural wives, which were a section of it. And then in the extensions book, where I looked primarily at Joseph Smith Mormonism, I was able primarily in the chronology to include achieving women and prominent women, such as the first state legislator, as a Mormon woman in Utah. But here, it was not really possible for me to do that. But I will say that when I was going through those 13,000 company files in the church, not in the church, in the state archives, looking for the church general authorities' involvement, I came across many, as early as the early 1870s, of women having equal roles as directors and officers of companies, or companies formed in Utah that were all women companies, including mining companies. And I mentioned this to Leonard, that this would, be, I didn't take notes on this because I had to budget my time, but I noticed it, and I pointed it out to Leonard that if somebody came to him, particularly a woman, who was interested in women's history, going through those 13,000 files would be painstaking, but it would allow somebody to do a history of women in corporate leadership from the pioneer period as far as the researcher wanted to bring it, because those files continued up with, including the oaths and affidavits of new officers and directors into the 1950s. And that, is a story that still hasn't been told.
It hasn't.
I reminded Leonard about that almost every decade, from the time I found them in 1975 to the mid-1980s, and then in the mid-90s I made that suggestion again. And I'm pretty sure, if I'm not, this isn't false memory syndrome, I'm sure that he said that he had recommended that as a topic, as a possibility. But it's a daunting thing to say, well, here are 13,000 files in the bowels of the Utah State Archives. and you're this, 22-year-old graduate student, go bury them, burrow into them for women. And in some ways, it's like needles in haystacks, because most of the corporation directors and officers were men. So as far as I know, no one has ever taken up that suggestion that I made to Leonard.
Wow. Well, that answers my question, because you're so thorough. I thought, well, if there were any women on any of the boards of the companies, he would have mentioned it. But then that's a whole other project.
Yeah, there were women in what you could call traditional women's companies.
Okay.
Women in dressmaking companies.
Okay.
Women in companies that related to medical care.
Yeah.
But there were also women who were in Desert Hospital.
Yeah.
But also there were women who were the sole directors and officers of mining companies.
Right. That is an interesting place where women show up. I mean, you have the Silver Queen, who, she wasn't Mormon though, but.
No.
But you do have women in mining. But that's interesting. So then you would say it's because they were in women's companies and they were not in the boards of the men's companies.
Well, not just in the men's company. There are thousands of men's companies that I didn't include because they didn't include men who were general authorities.
Yeah, right.
If
So
it was a millionaire, let's see, some of the early millionaires, David Eccles. I came across David Eccles, who was one of Utah's first Mormon millionaires in many, many companies.
Yeah.
But I never mentioned him because he was not a general authority.
So would you say it's, from what you know then, it's fair to say that where women do show up is in the women's companies and not in the men's, and that's pretty much
It
it?
varied because there were women where the husband of the woman, or maybe the father of the woman, was the president of the company, and a wife or a daughter would be a director.
Okay.
So that often happened. Not so much becoming officers of the company in which their relative was president, but very often being one of the directors.
Right.
And I quote from one of in fact it was where the company turned down an apostle's proposal, where it was two women on the board of this company who voted out his proposal for the company to invest in his proposal.
Yeah.
And so there were women who had corporate roles that were significant, but typically they were a minority.
Yeah, okay.
It was a man's world.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I realize that. I realize that that's why they don't show up in volume 3. Of course, the ways that they do show up in origins and extensions is really, really important, and I mined all of that information for great material. But yeah, it's just a sad fact of history that they're not in the church-led corporate situation until recently. That is a recent change where women are being appointed to high-level boards now, and Sharon Eubank is making history. And when I say these things, people are not encouraged. They say, oh, they roll their eyes and they say, that's a baby step, that's nothing. And I'm saying, no, it's huge.
And Sherry Dew, for example, is no figurehead.
Right.
She is a powerful, dynamic leader of a corporation that is very significant within the LDS Church. I don't know if it's significant in terms of profits, but it certainly is significant as a traditional company that Mormons look to provide them books that they feel they can trust.
Yeah, I forgot to mention her. I mean, she really made history because she headed not only Deseret Book, but now she's over all of the church communications.
But because she's not a general authority, she shows up only when I talk about this interlocking directorates. And I don't think I name her in the footnote. I just said the president of Deseret Book, but it was Sherry Dew who was in this linkage of Mormon-led corporations that were all connected with a particular corporation.
Yeah, interconnected.
Interconnected.
That interconnected nature of it. Well, that's interesting. So there's a dissertation project for somebody out there. some really energetic feminist historian in her 20s who wants to spend
Hours,
5 years.
months.
Any other final comments? This has been wonderful
It's been great.
for you to take the time
Oh,
to
I'm
give
glad
this
to.
overview and about your own journey, and then go into the details of how you really did this project. I think it's important for people to know what it really takes to do history and to do the kind of history that you do, what it really takes.
So,
And you're willing to pay a price that few people are.
so we know not to dare pick it up.
Yeah, that's right. You be warned. It's
Don't-
like be afraid, be very afraid.
Don't be a
Do not
historian.
become a historian.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So thank you very much, Mike.
thank you.